Welcome back, contingency heads. It's slightly future Andy again. Okay, so what we've got right now is the second half of our conversation from last week about AI and higher education. Where we pick up is me and Matt Brown talking a bit about AI has changed my teaching, but not for the worse, by Carlo Rotella, an op-ed from the New York Times. I've linked it in the show notes again. We pick up our conversation there from last week. If you haven't heard the one from last week, hey, go back and give it a listen. And then we move on to talk about a variety of other topics, other authors. I've linked those in the show notes too. So we're going to pick back up with Matt making a point about Rotella and kind of just go from there. And then if you listen to the end, we're going to talk about where we're going next time. Here's the spoiler. It turns out Matt and I are not just talking about AI on accident. I've actually only figured this out in the last few weeks. Turns out there's a reason for this, and I'm going to tell you why and how we're going to go from this from here. All right. So back to our conversation from last week. See you at the end of the pod.
You know, there's one more thing I wanna maybe say about this last one.
All right.
Just I think it can be a real quick back and forth. The other thing that Rotella argues for is putting a lot more emphasis on what's happening in the classroom.
Right.
I just want to point out that there's been a kind of movement away from this. I mean, COVID was a big driver of it, but even before that, a kind of critique of class participation as a requirement was sort of in motion for various reasons. And Rotella's trying to push us back in the opposite direction towards classroom participation. Do you think that he's missing something there?
I'm of two minds about that. I think the embodied participation in the classroom is a really good thing. I think it's a really important thing. I see what he's saying. I also know that at my teaching load, every semester, I will get at least one student who has some kind of a classroom participation assignment that I've asked them to do and comes to me in a very heartfelt way and says, Professor Famigletti, I have terrible anxiety. I have a stutter. I have, I'm on the Asperger's, the autism spectrum. I have, they have some very legitimate issue going on that prevents them from doing that. My sense of them is that they're heartfelt. They are genuine. Like they really have this problem. And I always work with them and I make an accommodation for them and I figure something out. But at the same time, like that means we can't be too absolute about that idea of participation. I think we have to, in some way, and I think that's what drove some of the push away from participation as like a requirement. This understanding that we're getting lots of different people coming into the space, this understanding that people for a really long time who were embodied like you and me tended to dominate classroom discussions, right? I know I dominated a fair share of classroom discussions and didn't really understand that I should be ashamed of that until like 5 years ago. Like I remember, do you remember our friend Kelly who went to Dragon Con with us a couple of times? You must have met Kelly at Dragon Con.
Yeah,
She went to grad school with
sure.
me. And at one point we were going to be in a class together. And she was like, at the end of the class, she was like, oh, that wasn't so bad, Andy. I heard you were terrifying to be in class with. And it wasn't until just a couple of years ago that I realized that that was not meant as a compliment. Like I was like, this I'm terrifying to be in class. Yeah. So like being sensitive to those dynamics, I think is going to be a really important way of thinking about how we make classroom participation that works for everybody. Right. And I think it's hard. I think it's really, really hard. I think it is easy for people in our embodied position to be like, yeah, just get out there. And I think it is important to encourage some of that. And I think we got to think about how to do that. And actually, I'm hopeful that I'm doing okay with that these days, because I actually ran into one of those students who had a big anxiety problem and had asked me to help him out with that when I was walking to class. And they said, and I'd had them several semesters ago, and they said, "Hi, professor, do you remember who I am?" I'm like, "Oh yeah," and I remember their name and everything. I said, "Oh hi, how are you doing?" And they were just saying hello. So it was, they had a big smile on their face, seemed like they were happy to see me. So I guess I was doing something right, but I hope. So yeah, I think that's going to be
Yeah.
tricky, but I'm broadly on board with that. But we need to be sensitive to all the complications there. Is what I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that we have to be really careful about it. I also agree, though, with Rotella that it's
Yeah.
indispensable, right? It's not something we can do away with and should never have been, I think, something we tried to get away from.
Yeah, I think we do have to kind of figure out how to do that right. And I think that was
Yeah.
something I think we had a tendency when it looked like something was tricky or uncomfortable. I think there was this tendency to kind of retreat from some of those things. And I think one of the things that this moment is going to force us to do is be like, nah, it's tricky and it's uncomfortable, but we can't, I don't think we can just pull back from it. I think we're going to have to try to figure out how to do the work to make the thing happen. So then our last piece that we wanted to talk about was Patrick Lynn's why we're not using AI in this course despite its obvious benefits. Matt, you brought this one to my attention. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this piece? What's it doing?
Yeah, so Patrick Lynn, who's a philosopher who works on ethics of technology, basically, he's trying to do a thing that I'm tempted to do, which is just completely ban AI from the classroom, from the class in general, right? Ban its use. And he's trying to do so not merely by coming up with some way to deter people from using it, but he says like, I don't want to be a cop in the classroom, and neither do I, right? But he's going to try to persuade, right, students that it's against their interest to use it. So he's written a kind of long piece explaining the practical, ethical, and sort of future-oriented risks of using AI, students using AI, and especially in a class like his where it's considered cheating. And so it's addressed to the student and the main piece. And he says it's the first thing they read in their class and they discuss it and it sort of forms a foundation for how he's going to ask them not to use it in their class. I think he does a reasonably fair job of canvassing the limits and problems that might come along with using AI. He also acknowledges the benefits and explains why, despite the existence of some potential benefits, he wants his students to refrain. So that's kind of the core piece. And he sent a sort of follow-up article to the big philosophy news blog, Daily News, and generated some conversation there about how to implement such a ban.
What I have a couple of questions that this piece raises for me. One kind of more I don't know, big picture, and one much more pragmatic. I'll start with the more pragmatic one first. Like, what's the difference, or do you think there is a difference between banning AI in a class and doing what I do and what it sounds to me like what Carlo Rotella does, where I don't think of what I do as a ban because, like Rotella, I don't like to set rules I can't enforce. And I effectively don't think I can enforce an AI ban. So I don't ban AI, but I do tend to, with each assignment, say, listen, this is what I intend for you to learn by completing the process of this assignment. This is why I want you to do it. I I want you to write it on your own. Like, please, right? Please respect that. Like, is there a difference between a ban and an ask? Like, what's the difference?
Yeah, that gets at part of what I'm interested in about this piece too. Like, so definitely there's a difference, right, between asking them not to use it and telling them they can't use it. And it is precisely like an actual ban has to come with some kind of mechanism of deterrence, right? You can ask them, you can beg them, you can persuade them not to do it, and we can talk about whether his persuasion is compelling or would be effective or could be effective. But he's saying, no, I'm going stronger. There will be consequences if you use it, right? I'll consider it cheating, and follow up accordingly. And yeah, I mean, so like I worry. I mean, this is precisely where I'm worried. I'm worried about the cop shit, right? Like I'm worried I'm worried about how effective any of this will be without deterrence mechanisms in place. I'm worried about trying to implement deterrence mechanisms in general, like should I be policing them in that way? Should I be policing my students? I don't like it when my relationship to my students involves penalizing for them for stuff in general, right? I don't know if there is an effective way to do that in this case, right? Like supposedly the AI detectors are crap. I mean,
I mean, there's no supposedly about it. They are like that's the research says that pretty conclusively. Like
yeah.
they're not good.
I
And I'm
mean, I
not
haven't looked
surprised
into
that
it
they're not
myself.
good
Yeah.
because from a theoretical point of view, like detect how do you use statistics about text to detect text that's been statistically generated from human text? Like how
Right.
you can't. You can do a certain kind of stylometry that will pick up on like the default voice of the tool, but changing the default voice of the tool is quite easy. And so if any effort has been done to do that, like that stylometry piece will fail. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I personally still believe that I can detect when I've got a serious like writing assignment. I mean, not like a reading reflection or whatever, loosey-goosey stuff, but like when it's a serious philosophy paper, I believe I can detect when it's AI slop,
I
right?
think you should be really cautious about that because there is significant research that shows that we are over like I if you put me like if you gave me sodium pentothal right now and you were like, Andy, do you think you recognize AI text when you see it? I would probably say yes, but the research says I'm wrong.
Right.
Right.
And I have, like well-informed colleagues who agree with you, who think that this is crazy wishful thinking on my part at this point, especially if they're using premium LLMs, especially if they're
Mm-hmm.
using these AI humanizer tools that you
Yep.
can feed the LLM output into. So I don't know. I
And I
mean,
really worry like Lynn talks about something like that in his piece. Even producing, he says, writing that looks or sounds like AI writing may also be penalized as poor writing because it doesn't stand out in your authentic voice. And I really worry about that because what we know for sure is that students who are coming to English as a second language or who are just adapting to the language that is expected of them on a college campus are way more likely to produce things that sound wrong, right? Big air
yeah,
quotes, sound wrong. And I really worry about like, and so, which is not to say that I don't ask students, like, especially for like, I have a final reflection for like my digital humanities class. And I was like, listen, this should reflect your experience in the class. Tell me about your experience. Right. Like, and I have, in fact, I have brought plagiarism cases to the university academic honesty mechanism when I've had students produce things that I did not think like that I was confident were AI generated. But the reason I was confident they were AI generated was that I asked for something like I just said, like, tell me about the things we did in this class together. And then they gave me this thing that out of nowhere had like 17 outside sources that we never read in our class.
Mhm.
And then I was like, well, how did you make this? And then they didn't have a good answer for it. Right.
right.
So I think there's something to be said about like if you don't think something is coming from a student, like have a conversation with them, see where it takes
Sure.
you, see what happens.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I also think, I mean, I think this is something that like depends on the structure of the assignment and like the level that they're at. So like
Yeah.
I think that's a totally different conversation at the level of like freshman writing, first year freshman writing seminar or class rather, and like a graduate seminar paper, right?
Yes.
And in a philosophy class, if I'm having them write a paper, I'm almost always asking them to stake out a specific position and
Mm-hmm.
provide a structured argument for it based on sources, textual evidence, right? And a lot of AI generated papers like don't take are like sort of constitutionally incapable of staking out a controversial position. It's like me lead mouth, like it could be this or it could be that. Or like they can't real the argument doesn't really have a structure. It just has like lots of paragraphs that don't relate to each other.
Mm,
And then of course the famous hallucinated
right.
citation issue, right? But I
All of which
mean,
are not, yeah. And I do think that's the other way I try to square the circle, is really trying to make sure that my evaluation criteria are reflective of the kind of things that you were just talking about. Because I do think you're right. Like, if we want them to stake a position, do all that stuff, I do think the more recent models do a much better job at that. And especially with like careful prompting, do a better job of that. I do think this is where a certain amount of like in person discussion becomes an important piece of things.
mhm,
Like, not just having a paper assignment, but even like the paper you're describing. I think there might be something to be said about having a conversation with them about it, you
sure.
know, as a way of just like making sure that there is some connection in the body to what's in the paper.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's another way to do that right now. But I do think for, yes, if you set it up so that the kind of goals you're talking about are in the evaluation rubric, then you almost don't have to worry about like, am I going to go after the student for plagiarism? It's like, well, I told you
Right.
to do this, you didn't do it. So
Right.
I'm
Right.
just going to evaluate this as poorly. I do
Uh,
get a little wiggly about the notion of authentic voice, even though it's something I ask students for and I encourage them to do. I get wiggly about requiring them to do it because of like there's a weird emotional work piece that I wonder how sustainable that is. Like
mm.
not everything I write is in an authentic voice. Like I try to get a lot. Like I'm a fairly authentic voice kind of person. I feel like a lot of my stuff is, but some of it isn't. And
Mhm.
especially in positions where like I feel like it's easier to have authentic voice from a position of power than not. I think that's a weird thing that we ask students like to bring into the
Mhm.
classroom. But yeah, that's my kind of wiggliness about that. I don't know. Well, you were sorry to
You,
say something there. I cut you off. Sorry.
no, that's okay. That's okay. Do you know the anecdote about Picasso and authenticity?
No.
So, and this could very well be apocryphal, but apparently, an art, Picasso is quite old at this point, and a art collector has bought some Picasso pieces. He's very proud of his acquisition, and he's a fancy enough guy that he's able to get Picasso to come to his house and verify that these are real Picassos. Like these are authentic. And so he comes over, he shows the pieces to him, and he says, "Oh yeah, that one that's not a real Picasso, right?" And the guy's like, "Oh no, like I have this whole paper trail and all these, this whole thing, and like, what went wrong? I'm so upset." And he's like, "Oh, well, hold on, no, no, sorry. Like I did paint that. It's just one I painted to make some money. It's not a real painting."
Yeah. No, and I mean that is like we all do that, right? Like I do worry about this idea of the authentic. I think it has become this, this kind of very well-intentioned thing that has brought us to some very weird places. Like I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
the thing that is appealing to many people about Donald Trump is that he is authentic. And I think people get like, oh no, he's not. He kind of is though, because I don't think he has the kind of rhetorical sense to make the very carefully calculated statements that we are like used to hearing from politicians. Like he kind of just lets things fall out of his mouth. And those things are terrible. I would like to stress they are awful,
Right.
but they are in a sense authentic in the way that they are not like triangulated in some careful way. Right. So, yeah. So I
Yeah.
do worry about that.
We could do a whole episode on authenticity because I think, well,
Oh, we
maybe we couldn't
should.
because I'm
All right.
maybe we couldn't because I think we maybe are on the exact same page about it. I think it goes, frankly, it goes back to like the philosophical granddaddy of authenticity himself, right? Heidegger is the one who really introduced this concept into our lexicon.
Oh,
And what was he authentically?
a Nazi.
Yeah. So It's
Unless he was.
like
No,
poisoned.
you know what? Stay tuned, listeners. Authenticity is contingent. We're going to figure out how to do it, but not today. So Lynn's interested in this questions of authenticity, of classroom writing. Those are maybe a little bit problematic. The other kind of thing that I think he opens up that I think is interesting, like he's trying to list towards the end all of these problems, all of these reasons to avoid LLMs. And it was really striking to me that he's talking about what LLMs can't do. And he kind of posits that in a way that I think has a certain kind of internal contradiction that I don't think is really a failure on his part. I think it's a thing that we're still struggling with in terms of understanding what LLMs are and what they do, right? He writes, LLMs are not information retrieval systems like an ordinary search engine, but they're information generation systems. They're designed to generate or invent new content from what they are trained on or have learned. In this design, there's no inherent connection to truth, just a statistical correlation to the next word in their string of outputted text. The output just needs to sound like what someone might say, not what's actually true. But then later, he kind of says something that's almost kind of in contradiction to that. He says, to be sure, LLMs can be impressive in their ability to sniff out subtle patterns in massive data sets and perform other superhuman operations, but they can't really think outside their box. They interpolate, pulling out patterns or remixing things that already exist inside their knowledge base, right? The problem is that too many users don't recognize the design limitation. They expect LLMs to be more capable, but can't or aren't careful enough to recognize LLM outputs that are derivative or flat out hallucinations. And I'm kind of left wondering, like, which is it? Are they too novel or aren't they novel enough? Like, what do
Yeah.
you think?
I mean, I think there's kind of two things going on there. Like one is those two quotes are like they're two different levels of description of the system, how it works. But also, I think in a sense it's both, right? They're both too novel with respect to a certain kind of use, and they're not novel enough with respect to a different kind of use. So like the information retrieval, not information retrieval, but information generation, next token prediction, sort of text generator. That's like a functional description of how it works, right? The like interpolation from a data set thing is a description of the kind of underlying machinery, how it works. So it's not the case, as I understand it, that LLMs, once they are trained, can sniff out subtle patterns in massive data sets. No, right? The sniffing out of subtle patterns in massive data sets happened when the training happened, right?
Yes and no. If you give it another data set to kind of sort through, it might be able to make certain correlations in that. I think what's tricky here is, I guess for me, what is happening is that we tend to fall into is we want to compare LLMs to minds, and that's not what they are. Or we want to compare them to existing forms of recording, and they're not that either. I think what's happening in his first piece is he's comparing an LLM to like a traditional static piece of written text. Every time you go back to that written text, it shows you the same thing, right? You open up the book, it says the same thing. You run a Google search, as long as the underlying like documents have not changed, the Google search shows you the same stuff, right? Every time you open it up, it's not slightly different. An LLM is not that. Every time you ask an LLM a prompt, you get a slightly different answer within certain bounds. So yes, it's not a recording. The second one is trying to compare them in a way that I'm not sure is entirely fair, but still is trying to do this to like a mind, right? Like if we're thinking we can come up with new stuff, yes, it's kind of based on the stuff we've all seen before, but it can go outside the box in certain ways, in ways that at least at current, it doesn't seem like LLMs can do. And what I think we've got to wrap our heads around that I think points to what LLMs might be good for more broadly is that they're neither of those things. They are a recording of patterns derived from signs that I think ends up being analogous to the patterns that we have. And the other thing, in the other quote, what he's doing is he's comparing the LLM to a mind. He's thinking about all the things we can do when we think and pointing out the ways that it can't quite do that. And Catherine Hales kind of has a take on this. She calls it fragility of reference, that LLMs don't have the understanding of symbols that we do, and so they will sometimes like go out of context. They will produce unexpected results, or they tend to just kind of turn over the same things that they saw in their data sets. I was actually reading a really interesting piece, I should dig it up, a while ago, that suggested that one of the things they do is they actually don't represent, like, the amount of representation of a particular idea or trope or symbol in LLM output is not proportional to how it's included in the input, that they tend to amplify common stuff in the input even more than it was in the inputted data. That if you give an LLM something that talks about cats like 60% of the time and dogs 20% of the time and other animals like 15% of the time and some other topic 5% of the time, you don't get that same distribution in the outputs. You get like cats like 80% of the time and everything else gets pushed down, right? Which is another kind of like fragility of reference. But, right, what's interesting to me is that they are doing something. They are recording something that has some kind of correlation to what we think about as, kind of the meaning of a sign, right? Like what Saussure would have called like the signified. What it's something that Peirce would describe as like the like relationship between like an interpretant and an object. Like there's some kind of like machine interpretant there in Peirce's terms almost, that is close enough to our own understanding that the outputs at least appear meaningful.
Right.
And that's interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole interesting metaphysical question about how whatever they're doing is related to minds. The fragility of reference thing reminds me of what in sort of classic AI discussions was called the frame problem. Like basically you can build an AI system to do something, but it's really hard to get them to sort of figure out what is and isn't relevant, right, to any particular moment or topic or task. And they've sort of tried to brute force their way around the frame problem by just putting everything in there and then, running it super fast, right? Basically.
Yes, but then the other thing that they do with that is reinforcement learning from human feedback, which is, I think,
Right,
a
that's true.
big piece of the monster that we tend not to talk about,
Right.
where like and that's important for frame problems because the kind of machine learning systems that AI is based on have a particular kind of out of context problem where if they go out of the context they've learned, they tend to drift further and further off course, right? The analogy that was most useful for helping me understand it was one that Ellen Howe includes in her Empire of AI. She talks about somebody who was trying to train a machine learning system to play Mario Kart. And like, so what he did was he played Mario Kart and he had the machine kind of watch what he did and learn from his decisions and then replay them. And it would do fine. But if it ever got a little bit off course, it would go all the way off course until it just drove into a ditch, right? Because the minute it was out of that expected frame, it didn't know what to do. And so the way that they fixed that was then by giving it feedback. When it got a little bit off course, he would sort of, tell it go back over there, and it would learn from those inputs and get like kind of steered back to where it was supposed to go and kind of learn when it was going off course. And my understanding is that our current LLM systems, the the moment when they go from like this weird text monster that was ChatGPT 2 to the uncanny almost person that is, or sorry, it was just GPT 2. It wasn't ChatGPT yet. That was ChatGPT, was a thing called instruct GPT, which had received instruction, right? Reinforcement learning. And that was what kind of like steered it onto course. So there's that piece too, right? Like there's another piece of meaning or something like meaning that is gotten from all of these conversations it's had. And I think the
Right.
interesting thing there is that like it does give you a kind of recording that is flexible in interesting ways that can be
Sure.
useful. Like there have been several occasions, and other people have reported to this, like people I trust have reported this to me anecdotally as well. But I've also experienced this where I'm like, I kind of remember this idea, but I don't remember the exact words for it. And a traditional search engine will just like take you around in circles forever unless you finally hit upon the right search term that gets you onto your text base. But on several occasions, I've been able to go into something like ChatGPT and be like, there's this thing, it's kind of like this, it's about these ideas, it was published about then at this time, and it's figured out what I wanted, right?
Yeah. There is some kind of like holistic semantic network thing that it is capturing, right? And so it's this is, I think, what is so I think it's why it can do that, right? If you can get some terms, some words that sort of are properly related to the thing you're actually looking for in the wider body of human language use, right? It can kind of get you there, right?
Right.
I think this is why it can produce such compelling sounding text, why it can sound so natural, right? I mean, the technology that this is based on that was developed in the 80s by people like Hinton and McClellan and Rumelhard and Cottrell and so on.
Right.
Like they thought they were developing a computer system that mimicked what the human brain was doing,
Right.
right? I
That's
mean,
why they
it's
called it a neural
neuromorphic.
network. Yeah.
Yeah. And, Hinton still thinks that. I mean, he thinks that obviously there are important differences, but, he's convinced that GPT understands concepts, right? And I think if you think that there's something right to the neural network model of the brain, then there's something like understanding it's doing and what cashing that out. There's like a deep philosophical thing to do there, right?
Yes. But I think what I'm proposing is almost that we sidestep that, right?
Yeah.
Like that on
Well,
some level, it doesn't like it does matter that their understanding, quote unquote, is not our understanding. But this was always one of my big takeaways from Ted Underwood, who does a lot of really interesting digital humanities work. One of the things that Ted has argued, often about much simpler statistical models in the past, but he's also argued it at times about LLMs, is the whole value that they have is that they don't understand text the way we do, right? That's what's valuable about them. Like, and so I think a lot of what we get stuck on is either we have boosters of AI being like, these things are minds, right? Like they are
right.
minds. They are like, I got into a social media argument with somebody the other day, was like, no, ChatGPT is conscious. And I'm like, you're crazy. And like all of a sudden, 17 other people started jumping out of the woodwork and like yelling at me because like there is definitely a subculture that thinks
Yeah.
ChatGPT is literally a person, right? Like
Yeah.
it is conscious, it is talking to them, it is their friend. I don't think
Yeah.
that's true, right? So we get stuck on that as boosters, though, like from Sam Altman, who's like, it's going to be super intelligence, it's going to basically be God, to these guys who are like, no, my AI girlfriend is a real girlfriend. Like, oh, that whole spectrum is on that kind of side. And then we have an anti side who's like, no, they're not minds, right? And I would
Yeah.
say I'm more sympathetic to that argument, but sometimes that's like, well, no, they're not minds, therefore they're just worthless.
Right.
But
Right.
if they're neither minds, if they're instead kind of a another form of prosthetic memory, like writing kind of is, then we're back at the like Socrates moment again, where like, yes,
Right.
it's gonna destroy our written culture the way that writing destroyed oral culture, but maybe there's something on the other side. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm convinced by that, but I'm not sure I'm not convinced by it. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah.
Like I
I
think
know
there
what you're
could be
saying. Yeah.
something there in terms of like this could be another way of storing and retrieving and working through information the same way
Mhm.
writing has been. And that might really upend a lot of what we just talked about because a lot of what we just talked about is like how do we adapt pedagogy so we can help students continue developing the kind of thinking practices that are valuable in a literate culture even when you have a machine that will simulate those practices and prevent you from developing them, right? And
Right.
I want to stress in the classroom that's exactly what I'm doing because I don't understand this other idea well enough to understand where to go with it yet. But I think the
Yeah.
potential limit to that is if there is anything to the idea that there is something going on with an LLM that is a novel way of recording and retrieving information, then we're gonna eventually gonna have to figure out what kind of cognitive tasks are we doing with those machines. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure yet. I don't think it's prompt engineering, but it might be something, you know?
Yeah. I mean, so much to say here. For one, I am worried. This is gets at some of the risks that Lynn talks about.
Yeah.
I am worried about those people you brought up who
Yes.
are convinced that ChatGPT is their friend or their girlfriend or is conscious. I mean, I think this thing is able, in a sense, it's like hacking our brains, right? Like the way that we are tuned to language, the human mind is tuned to language, whether that's innate or developed or whatever, it is so essential to the way we relate to the world that the fact that it can talk in a realistic way to us leads to these kind of wild over attributions to it, right? And then the fact that it is, through reinforcement learning, like they're training these things to like encourage engagement, keep us on the platform,
Yeah.
right? Like be like to say things that make us feel good about ourselves, right? Like all of this strikes me as super dangerous. But I also agree with you, like just like the question of like how similar is a forklift to human musculature is not really important as a question for thinking about how when we should and shouldn't use a forklift. Like thinking about how much ChatGPT is like a mind does not help us think about when we should or shouldn't use
Yeah. There
ChatGPT.
was some
Like,
famous cognitive scientist, philosopher, computer scientist. I'll remember who they are and I'll put their full attribution in the show notes. But they once famously said that asking if a computer can think is no more relevant than asking if a submarine can swim. Right? Like
right,
it's just it's not the
right,
same thing, yes, but like what is it good for? And I think that
right.
yeah, I think that's a much larger conversation. I think we're gonna have to come back to that. I do agree with you though, like in the current moment, all of the things that make LLMs compelling in this short-term sense, like you want to talk to them, they can be very flattering, they can indulge in people's worst narcissistic impulses. All of those things in the current moment strike me as incredibly dangerous, in
Hmm.
part because like this technology is being almost wholly run by some of the worst people in the world, right? Like
Yes.
it's really in very dangerous hands. I'm not sure it's actually like a lot of times the thing that is striking to me is like, can you believe people are having these relationships with not real people? I'm like, yeah, I watched a lot of TV in the 90s. I can believe that, right?
Sure.
Like I played a
Yeah.
lot of video games. I had a lot of parasocial relationships. I think it does seem like it's compelling and it's dangerous and but
Yeah.
all of those parasocial relationships were probably compelling and dangerous too. Like people
Right.
have parasocial relationships with political leaders. They thought they were
Right.
going to have a beer with George Bush or whatever. We all
Right.
we all thought Barack Obama was our professor. It's yeah,
Right.
like it's dangerous and it's weird to what extent it's novel. I'm not always sure. But I think there
Yeah.
might be something novel there because it does talk to you in a way that is a little bit
It's
new and I wonder about
it's
that.
so yeah, I mean it's so interactive. I mean, like, and I think some of these cases of like, AI psychosis and the sort of tragic things that have happened to people as a result of carrying on a long-term interaction with some of these chatbots. I mean, I think, ultimately, like we need to bring in psychologists and sociologists and neuroscientists to like really tell us like what having this relationship with a tool is doing to us. But I also think, I'm not ready to give up on the idea of literate culture. For one, I worry that in this case, LLMs are built on literature, right? They're built on
Mm,
text. If we stop producing it, we stop being able to produce LLMs, right? Or anyway, the sort of semantic landscape stagnates at the point at which we sort of bring LLMs to the fore, right? Maybe that's why in the 24th century they haven't got any culture that wasn't developed in the 20th century, right? Like they only
in the 24th century, they barely have any culture past like 1950. Like, and they only get to 1950 in the 24th century. In the 23rd, they're still, it's all classical music, wall to wall. Yeah, I want a Star Trek The Next Generation reboot where, Geordi goes and puts on some classical music and it's the Wu-Tang Clan. Like, that would be amazing.
Yeah, but also like I just for like the reason that like I mean I think writing is working out for your mind, right? Like
Yeah.
writing isn't like well, it's not even that. I mean writing is thinking. Engaged reading is thinking, right? Developing your own intellectual perspective, call it authentic
No, yeah.
voice or something else, like that's part of what becoming your own individual person is about,
Yes.
right?
I mean, writing and reading are thinking. That's what's important about them. That's why I tell my students are important about them. But of course, people thought for 248,000 years without writing, and only for the last 2,000 have we thought with it. And only for the last like century and some change have most of us thought with it, right? For most of
Yeah.
that 2,000 years, there was this tiny little priesthood of literate people. Like mass literacy is like brand freaking new, right?
Yeah.
And so, yes,
And
I'm not
and
ready
look,
to give
not
up on literate culture either, but I'm not sure if that's just because I love it, because I was raised in it, and it's what I know, or if there is like, is there some intrinsic
yeah.
value that's more than just this is what I know and love, you know?
I mean, it's certainly been a bumpy ride, and not everything about it has been perfect. But like at least at the cognitive level, I think the last 2,000 years, and definitely the last, 150 years, have been pretty impressive,
No,
right?
for sure.
In terms of the capability of human thought, right? Yeah, like we can literally survive without it, but that's not all we want, right?
All right. So let's wrap it up.
Okay.
I feel like my takeaways from this conversation are that we can adapt the higher education classroom to the current LLM moment if we really think carefully about our pedagogy and our values and what we want to do in the class. And we really try to emphasize the embodied experience of being in a classroom and what it means, then we definitely can adapt to the moment we're in right now. The larger context that we educate for in the medium term, I think, is going to require some kind of larger conversation about the value of education and how we make the case for the value of education to a very broad public. Like, how do we do that? And how do we get policies that recognize that? I think that is a a larger conversation we're going to have on the at the medium term. I'm not sure we know exactly how to do that yet. I think there's a lot of rhetorical work to do there that folks are going to have to do to figure out how to do that, and that's something to come back to. And like longer term, the open question for me is, okay, we can adapt our pedagogy to try to preserve like the things we valued from literate culture. And I think that's normal and that's appropriate, right? Like
Mhm.
in some ways, a lot of what we were doing in our literate education system was hanging on to stuff that we valued from oral culture. And maybe that's not so surprising. Like, okay, but the interesting question of how do we actually, like, if there is any there with the LLM and AI more broadly, the question of how we adapt to that, I think, is a longer term question that I suspect we're going to have to return to after the current AI bubble crashes, maybe we'll have a moment where we can get some more perspective on things then. That's my kind of takeaway from what we talked about. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah. Yeah.
What kind of takeaways do you have?
I mean, I want to bring the takeaway back to stuff is contingent, right?
Yes.
Because I think there's a narrative in higher education that AI is inevitable,
Mm-hmm.
right? That we have to adapt or die, right? And I think that's not right in two respects, right? Number one, if I think what is more like you were saying, what's more likely inevitable is the AI bubble bursts, right? And we reset to a much more limited and normal relationship to the technology because I think the economics of the whole situation, they're all just they're betting the bank on AGI superintelligence in the next 5 years, right? Or next 2 years or next
Yeah.
6 months or something. Yeah, and that's just not going to happen. But also, like, we have, we as teachers, we as educational institutions, we as students, if we're students, like, we also have the ability to like change like pick our relationship, right? To the technology, right? We can resist, we can adopt, we can adapt, we can reject, right? And we have to like, it's not like we can do anything that we set our mind to because there are
Mm-hmm.
material constraints, obviously. There are technological constraints and social cultural constraints, but like we have a lot of freedom, right? I think these articles really stress that, and I like at their best when they're sort of stressing win-win scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
I also think, you come back to the bigger picture, higher education policy and goals. We've been on a very clear path for at least 50 years in terms of where higher education is going. And, we don't have to stay on that path, right? As a society, we can pick a different relationship to higher education or to education in general that is inspired by other things in our past, ideals that we've never really realized, and also new thoughts, right, about what we should be doing. And I think we're on a bad track, right? But we're not trains on a railroad. We're Jeeps on the trail. We can go in a different direction.
All right. Jeeps on a trail. Okay, that was our conversation about AI and higher ed. Next time, tune in to listen to me and Matt Brown talk about Matt's dissertation advisor, Dr. Paul Churchland. Now, here's the thing. I only found out that Dr. Churchland was Matt's dissertation advisor a few weeks ago, and a light sort of came on in my head because Churchland is known for being a neurophilosopher, someone who's interested in the neural basis of things like concepts and reasoning. And that makes him super relevant to our contemporary moment of neural network based AI deep learning systems. So, between that and my interest in the digital humanities and digital information and culture, gee, it sure seems like Matt and I have not been talking about AI as an accident. So, we're going to talk to Matt about Paul Churchland and what we can learn from Churchland in the contemporary moment for our next episode. And I will see you all back then. Laters.